The Field of Mud and Iron. August 26, 1346. In a muddy field near the village of Crecy, northern France, 9,000 weary Englishmen face 30,000 of Europe's proudest knights. The French hold every advantage: overwhelming numbers, gleaming armor, and the confidence of centuries. Their nobles ride in plate and silk, arguing not over victory, but over who will have the honor of killing the English king. Yet, 4 hours later, that arrogance lies buried in the mud. 1,500 French nobles are dead, princes, dukes, and counts among them. The English lose just 40 men. 5 centuries of knightly dominance end that afternoon, ended by peasants armed with sticks and strings. The blind king of Bohemia, refusing to sit idle, ties his horse to his companions and charges straight into death. French cavalry trample their own men in panic. The Genoese crossbowmen, hired for gold, are slaughtered by the very nobles who brought them. For days after, crows grow so fat on noble flesh that they can barely fly. This was Crecy, the day medieval warfare drowned in its own pride. Here, the belief that honor made men invincible died in the mud, and the 100 Years' War truly began with France's most devastating defeat. By the end of this story, you'll see how a weapon worth 10 shillings destroyed armor worth 1,000 pounds. How knights butchered their own mercenaries mid-battle, and how one blind king's final charge became the last noble act of a vanished world. The Road to Crecy. King Edward III of England had invaded Normandy with 15,000 men, laying claim to the French throne through his mother. His campaign wasn't one of conquest. It was terror by design. Villages burned, crops vanished, and the countryside was left in ashes. It was called a chevauchée. Licensed destruction meant to prove that the French king couldn't protect his own land. But Edward III knew what they didn't. Their time was over. Outnumbered 3-1, his men exhausted from weeks of raiding, Edward placed his hope in 5,000 Welsh and English longbowmen, peasants and petty criminals trained since boyhood because English law forced them to practice archery every Sunday after church. His men were divided into 3 groups, archers forming a V between them to create crossing arcs of fire. Then came his most shocking decision. He ordered his knights to dismount and fight on foot beside the archers. For the noble-born, it was unthinkable. Their lives were built around the thunder of the charge, their horses worth more than gold. But Edward demanded obedience. Pride meant nothing compared to survival, and so armored lords trudged into the mud beside peasants in wool hoods, a sight Europe had never seen. That night the English camp was calm. Archers rubbed beeswax into their bowstrings to keep them dry. Stakes were driven into the soil, ditches dug by torchlight. Edward even had meat and ale served so his men could sleep fed and ready. Across the field, the French army staggered in after a forced march, hungry, disorganized, and still arguing over who would lead the glorious charge. Their camp looked more like a tournament than a battle. At dawn, the French vanguard marched through burnt fields and smoking villages, their anger rising with each step. They had found the invader, and vengeance burned hotter than reason. By 4 in the afternoon, Philip's army had arrived, soaked in sweat and fury. He ordered them to rest and wait for morning. But his nobles refused. They saw an enemy on a hill and smelled glory. The king's command dissolved in arrogance. As rain began to fall, the English calmly unstrung their bows, tucking the strings under their helmets to stay dry. The Genoese crossbowmen, hired by France, did not. Their wet strings went slack, useless. That small act of preparation, just a few seconds of foresight, would decide the fate of thousands. The slaughter at Crecy trumpets blared. Banners snapped. The French knights surged forward, trampling discipline beneath their hooves. The Genoese mercenaries advanced first, 5,000 of them, their great shields left behind in the baggage train. They loosed a volley of bolts that fell pitifully short. Then came the English reply. 5,000 longbows fired in unison. Witnesses said the sound was like thunder. The sky darkened with arrows. 60,000 every minute. Within moments, the Genoese line collapsed. They turned and fled, only to meet their death under French hooves. The Count of Alençon shouted, "Cut down this rabble," and the knights did, slaughtering their own mercenaries for blocking the path to glory. And so began the charge of 12,000 knights, uphill, through mud, over corpses, and into the teeth of English arrows. At long range, the shafts shattered horses. At close range, they punched through visors, armpits, and joints. Those not pierced were still crushed inside their armor by the impact, bones breaking beneath steel. Wave after wave fell the same way. Horses stumbled into pits, legs impaled on sharpened stakes. The rain-soaked ground turned to a trap, sucking knights down into the muck. Archers ran out of arrows, sprinted forward, and plucked fresh ones from the dead to fire again. The blind King John of Bohemia demanded to join the fray. Blind for 10 years, he tied his horse's reins to those of his knights and charged straight into battle, swinging wildly, striking only air. When he fell, his men fell beside him, their reins still knotted together. When his body was found, sword still in hand, his eyes empty, even his enemies wept. Moved by his courage, Edward's son, the Black Prince, took John's emblem, 3 ostrich feathers and the motto, Ich dien, I serve. It remains the symbol of the Prince of Wales to this day. By sunset, the French had charged 16 times, 16 tides of pride crashing against English discipline. The oriflamme, France's sacred war banner, lay abandoned in the mud. King Philip himself was struck by an arrow through the jaw and dragged from the field, weeping and bleeding, as his nobles died around him. That night the English did not celebrate. They stood in silence, killing any wounded Frenchman who still moved. Archers finished knights with mallets and knives. Common men were beating nobles to death with sticks. The end of chivalry. At dawn on August 27th, the full horror became clear. The flower of French nobility was gone. Princes, dukes, and lords lay unrecognizable in the mud. So many died that there were not enough men of rank left to bury them with ceremony. Farmers later found bones and rusted armor for generations. The English had lost 40 men. The French, thousands. It wasn't just defeat, it was extinction. For the first time, noble blood meant nothing on a battlefield. The longbow had destroyed the very foundation of medieval warfare. A peasant's arrow could kill a king as easily as a thief. The social order cracked. The illusion of divine superiority shattered. The world learned that discipline and preparation mattered more than lineage or courage. Crecy's aftermath reshaped Europe. France's feudal system faltered. New armies rose, professional, trained, and disciplined. Wars became contests of position and firepower, not valor and charge. The romance of knighthood, the poetry of sword and steed, ended that day. And yet, one could still feel something noble lingering in the ruin. The blind king's final charge, the courage of doomed men, the stubborn pride that refused to yield, it was the last heartbeat of a dying world. Crecy was not just a victory for England. It was the birth of modern war. It proved that courage could not stop mathematics, and that honor could not deflect an arrow. On that muddy slope in 1346, the medieval world ended, killed not by kings or empires, but by 5,000 peasants who practiced archery every Sunday after church.